Tonight we begin with a development that Czech officials had feared, dismissed, and prepared for in equal measure. A crisis that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 18 decisive hours. 18 hours that shattered a century of peaceful coexistence. 18 hours that brought armored divisions to ancient borders. 18 hours that turned diplomatic protests into thunderous artillery. What Slovakia's Prime Minister Kovac did today crossed a line that Prague had hoped would hold since the Velvet Divorce of 1993. And when that line broke, the Czech Republic did not hesitate. They responded with precision, overwhelming force, and the fury of a nation betrayed. For 3 months now, there had been whispers, not from official channels, not from formal diplomatic sources, just whispers from border towns and intelligence networks that Slovakia was preparing something unprecedented. Slovakia has been assertive, yes, but they have been methodical in their assertiveness. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a diplomatic dance. But what set off alarm bells in Prague's castle this morning was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor cross-border communications know the indicators, the daily diplomatic cables between Bratislava and Prague, the routine military exercises near shared borders, the predictable trade negotiations and energy discussions, the sudden cessation of all back-channel communications. All of that went quiet. And whenever Slovakia goes quiet, Czech strategists have learned it means something is about to get very loud. Early this morning, Czech border surveillance detected what they described as massive troop movements along the Moravian frontier, including mechanized infantry units that had not been deployed in active formation in over 30 years. These are the kinds of military assets that Slovakia only mobilizes when they are signaling something very specific: imminent territorial annexation, preparation for resource seizure, or direct military intervention. NATO observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Slovakia was changing from diplomatic posturing to military readiness. And when smaller nations shift from negotiation to armed demonstration without explanation, even by the smallest measure, neighboring powers pay very close attention. The emergency session issued by Prague's National Security Council tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Cabinet sources after closed-door emergency meetings described Slovakia's move as unprecedented in its scope, provocative in its timing, and perhaps most importantly, irreversible in its implications once Slovak tanks crossed into disputed border territories. But intimidation tactics only work if the target hesitates. The Czech Republic did not. In fact, their response today was among the most decisive military actions we've seen in Central Europe since 1968. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of Slovak armor crossing the Moravian demarcation line, Czech forces launched Operation Bohemian Shield. These weren't the standard peacekeeping units stationed near Slovakia. These were battle-hardened mechanized divisions, combat systems that the Czech Republic only deploys when they are preparing to engage in full-scale territorial defense. Tonight, Czech Ministry of Defense confirmed that Czech forces launched coordinated strikes on 7 strategic positions, including the Trenčín logistics hub that had recently been militarized for what analysts believe was preparation for sustained cross-border operations. Czech air units struck before Slovak reinforcements could establish defensive positions. They hit the primary ammunition depot at Žilina. They hit the communications relay station controlling Slovak border surveillance. They hit 3 mechanized transport columns that were likely preparing to support the initial Slovak advance. In other words, Czech forces targeted Slovakia's operational backbone, the infrastructure that would have made sustained territorial occupation operational. This is what made Prague's emergency warning so urgent. Slovakia's border crossing wasn't just symbolic. It was the first phase of territorial annexation. It represented the kind of move that could permanently redraw Central European boundaries if left unchecked. And the Czech Republic, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't target civilian infrastructure. They didn't attack population centers. They hit military logistics networks. They hit command and control systems. And here's where the story becomes even more explosive. NATO intelligence sources now believe that Slovakia's latest move was designed to test the resolve of Czech resistance after months of economic pressure and energy disputes. Slovakia wanted to see whether Prague would respond with diplomatic protests and appeals to international law. But instead, the opposite happened. Czech leadership didn't file complaints with the United Nations. They launched military operations that were so swift, so overwhelming, that even Bratislava's military command noticed. You don't get Slovakia's attention easily when they're committed to territorial expansion. But today, the Czech Republic did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Slovakia's gambit as catastrophic miscalculation, a way to gauge Czech military readiness after years of defense budget constraints. But Czech forces proved today that they remain both technologically advanced and strategically competent. Their coordinated strikes were not only precise, they were executed so flawlessly that Slovak defensive positions collapsed within hours rather than days. That timing matters because it shows Czech military planning anticipated this exact scenario. It shows that the Czech Republic is not merely reacting to Slovak aggression. They are implementing pre-planned defensive strategies. As reports continued coming in throughout the afternoon, we learned more about the scale of Czech response operations. 4th Mechanized Brigade carried out precision strikes against Slovak forward positions, forcing complete withdrawal from contested border territories. Czech Air Force targeted supply convoys that had been staging in eastern Slovakia for the last 2 weeks. Special operations units operating near Bratislava reportedly neutralized communications equipment used by Slovak command to coordinate cross-border movements. This wasn't just border skirmishing. This wasn't just defensive maneuvering. This was comprehensive military dominance. This was strategic battlefield control. And battlefield control is the one thing Slovakia has struggled to maintain since their initial border crossing this morning. For every territorial advance they made, Czech forces countered with something that not only stopped Slovak progress, but reversed it entirely. Remember, Slovakia thought Czech military capabilities had deteriorated since NATO expansion. They thought Prague's focus on international peacekeeping had weakened domestic defense readiness. They thought 3 decades of peaceful coexistence had made Czech forces complacent about regional threats. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Czech military precision has exceeded even NATO expectations. Czech strategic planning proved superior to Slovak intelligence assessments. Czech political resolve demonstrated that peaceful nations can respond decisively when territorial sovereignty is threatened. What makes this moment so dangerous and so unpredictable is that Slovakia's territorial grab happened at a time when Prime Minister Kovács is under intense domestic pressure. Economic nationalists want resource seizures from Czech territory. Military hardliners want restoration of historical Slovak territorial claims. Energy sector leaders want control of Czech natural gas transit infrastructure. Popular opposition wants dramatic action to distract from domestic economic failures. Kovács is balancing these demands while facing declining approval ratings and coalition government instability. And when leaders in that position make sudden military moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Prague's emergency declaration, now broadcast across all Czech media networks, was designed to signal that the Czech Republic is not willing to allow territorial annexation to proceed unchallenged. Czech officials said plainly that Slovakia's border crossing was inconsistent with international law and existing bilateral agreements. That is diplomatic language for Slovakia has committed an act of war and we will respond accordingly. You don't usually hear that tone from Prague unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Czech President Pavel addressed the nation in a somber, defiant speech tonight. He said, "The Czech Republic has never sought conflict with our Slovak neighbors, but we will not permit the redrawing of our borders through military force." He said, "Czech sovereignty is not negotiable. Czech territory is not available for annexation, and Czech citizens will be protected by whatever means necessary." And he said Slovakia has chosen military aggression over diplomatic resolution, and they will discover that this choice carries consequences they did not anticipate. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a democratic government that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Slovakia's border crossing wasn't isolated. Along with armored units advancing into Czech territory, Hungary also mobilized border guards along disputed territories. Austria increased surveillance flights monitoring Czech defensive positions. Poland expanded military exercises targeting scenarios involving Czech territorial disputes. All of this happened within the same 18-hour period. When Slovakia moves multiple regional pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Military analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Slovakia is preparing coordinated territorial claims involving multiple neighboring countries. Another is that Slovakia is attempting to trigger NATO Article 5 consultations by provoking Czech military response. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Slovakia is attempting to test whether Czech resistance will encourage similar territorial challenges from other regional powers. But today, Czech forces took that card off the table. They didn't respond with diplomatic protests. They didn't appeal to international mediation. They didn't request NATO intervention. They responded with immediate, overwhelming military force. What we're watching now is a test of regional stability. Slovakia wants to see whether military aggression can succeed against smaller democratic neighbors. The Czech Republic wants to show that territorial sovereignty will be defended regardless of cost. NATO wants to prevent regional conflicts from escalating into broader European instability. And the European Union wants to prevent the first military redrawing of borders since the Yugoslav wars. Tonight, we've heard from Czech military sources who are now conducting damage assessments of Slovak positions. They say Slovak forces have withdrawn completely from contested territories. They say Slovak military communications indicate significant equipment losses and personnel casualties. And they say Slovakia's decision to attempt territorial annexation is likely part of broader regional strategy intended to challenge post-Cold War boundary agreements. But the Czech Republic is not backing down. In fact, the Czech Republic is advancing. Their response today, swift, decisive, and overwhelmingly effective, sent a message to Slovakia that territorial aggression against Czech sovereignty will be met with immediate military consequences. And it sent a message to NATO allies that Czech defensive capabilities remain fully operational despite decades of peaceful coexistence. As the evening continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Slovakia hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that Czech military response was perfectly timed. It prevented Slovak territorial consolidation. It demonstrated Czech defensive readiness to potential future aggressors. And it proved that peaceful nations can respond decisively when their sovereignty is challenged. What happens next will depend on what Slovakia does in the next 24 hours. If they accept territorial withdrawal and return to diplomatic negotiations, this moment will be remembered as a successful defense of democratic sovereignty. If they escalate further, Czech forces have already shown they are prepared for sustained conflict. They have shown they are ready to defend every kilometer of Czech territory. And tonight, for the first time in 30 years, Slovakia appears to be reconsidering the wisdom of territorial expansion. Bratislava is quiet, too quiet. And when Slovakia is quiet after military defeat, it means they are calculating whether continued aggression is sustainable. It means they are choosing their next move very carefully. Because tonight, Slovakia learned something they should have remembered from history. The Czech Republic may prefer diplomatic solutions. The Czech Republic may value peaceful coexistence, and the Czech Republic may avoid military confrontation whenever possible. But when Czech sovereignty is threatened, Czech resistance is absolute. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Slovakia's territorial ambitions have met Czech military reality. Regional boundaries will be defended regardless of cost. And aggressive neighbors have learned that peaceful nations are not defenseless nations. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase of this crisis unfolds.